Austin Bidwell's Travels, From Wall Street to London Prison, 15 Years in Solitude, is a public domain work. Chapter 27. The Flowers, INTHE, Primrose, WAARE Suite. As narrated in an earlier chapter, I left England 2 days before the first lot of forged bills were sent in. I left serene and confident of the future. My departure was a happy event in a double sense. All my negotiations had been carried on at a considerable expense of nerve, and in leaving I left everything in such trim that success seemed certain, with all chance of danger eliminated from the venture. I felt that the trying toil was now all over, with nothing for me to do but to reap the harvest, and that without effort or care on my part. So, when the late November sun looked down on me, I crossed by daylight this time, standing on the deck of that same wretched Channel steamer. It looked on a happy man. I did not know then that success in wrongdoing was ever a failure. The anxious toil of the London and continental negotiations was a thing of the past. Was I not young? Wealth was or soon would be mine. Was I not in perfect health, body sound and digestion good? And, above all, was not the woman I loved awaiting me in Paris, to give herself to me, in all her youth and beauty? And then somewhere across the western waters, would I not find in some tropic seas a paradise, which gold would make mine, where I could bear my bride? And there, turning over a new leaf, live and die with the respect of all good men mine. Here was a stately structure I was going to erect, but how rotten the foundation! I, in my egotism, fancied, in my case at least, the eternal course of things would be stayed, and that justice would grant me a clean bill of health. She did give me that, but it was long years after, and only when she had had from me her pound of flesh to the very last ounce. I joined my sweetheart and her family at the Hotel St. James, Rue Saint-Honoré. She was an English lady, and for a whole year our courtship had been going on, and now, our wedding day being fixed a week ahead, we all set out sightseeing and having a good time generally. I now engaged the coachman I had met before as my valet, and a very good, all-around handy man he proved to be. Of course I was anxious to hear that the first coup on the bank had succeeded, but I was tolerably confident it was all right. Had it fallen through, it would have proved awkward for me. In that event, the Paris climate would have been too warm for me, and I would have had to find a score of excuses to hasten our marriage and leave for the Western world as speedily as possible. I had a 4-in-hand coach, and we drove everywhere in and around Paris, once to Versailles and on to Fontainebleau, where we dined, a merry party. What a strange world is this! What a stage it is, ever crowded with tragedies too! How absolutely in the dark we are as to the motives and actions of men. There I was, the centre of merry pleasure parties in gay Paris. A young dude, driving my 4-in-hand, and yet a criminal, waiting in owly expectation a telegram announcing success in a great plot, which, when it exploded, was destined to startle the business world and to hurl me from the summit of happiness, where I was revelling, apparently free from care, to the misery of a dungeon, banishing the happy smiles from my face and the joyous ring from my voice, leaving in place of the smiles the sombre gloom of the prison, and in place of the snatches of song and eager accents I was wont to speak with, the hushed voice subdued to prison tones. Late one morning, on opening my eyes, my first thought was, it will be hit or miss at the Bank of England within the next 60 minutes. We had engaged for a coaching party to Versailles and were to dine there. I left for the drive that day with a dim fear that before the sun set I might be under the necessity of leaving Paris in a hurry. When starting for Versailles, I left my servant behind to wait for the expected telegram, and to bring it to me by rail. We were at dinner, and I was just raising a glass of champagne to my lips when I saw my valet, Nunn, crossing the esplanade. He entered the room and handed me a telegram. Tearing open the envelope, I read, "All well, bought and shipped 40 bales." That meant the first lot for 40,000 had gone through safely. It was certainly a great relief. The next day I received 25,000 in United States bonds from George in London, my first share of the proceeds. I sold the bonds in Paris, receiving payment in French notes. On Thursday, the day before our marriage, I had a telegram from Mac and George to meet them in Calais, and to Calais I had to go. I arrived there at midnight, just before the Dover steamer got in, and was on the pier to meet them. We exchanged warm greetings. As we did so, Mac placed a small but very heavy bag in my hands, and they began laughing over my surprise. It contained L4 thousands in sovereigns, and was stuffed with bonds and paper money. We went to a hotel nearby, and there they counted out to me the very nice sum of 100,000 in gold, bonds, and French money. As they were going back on the same steamer, and I was to return to Paris by the train carrying the passengers of the steamer just arrived, we had only a brief half-hour's talk. After giving me the money, we went out and sat down on the pier, and that conversation and scene are forever impressed on my memory. I shall make no attempt to describe either, but could both be put on the stage, with the audience in possession of a full knowledge of the enterprise we were embarked in. There would be seen a picture of human life, such as the novelist or playwright never had the imagination nor the daring to depict. To the earnest student of human life, it would have been a revelation. There we were, 3 earnest, ambitious young men, enthusiastic for all that was good and noble. I about to wed a pure-souled woman, who thought me an angel of goodness, and about to fly with my plunder and bride to Mexico. My 2 companions were returning to London, to continue carrying out a giant scheme of fraud against a great moneyed institution. But there we were, with 100,000 in plunder at our feet, sitting under the stars, listening to the dash of the waves and talking not at all like pirates and robbers, but much more like crusaders setting out on a crusade, or like pilgrims going on a pilgrimage. I told my friends I should go to the city of Mexico for a year or 2, and then meet them somewhere in America, where we would unite our wealth to inaugurate some scheme that would benefit thousands in our own generation and millions in the generations to come. We would hedge ourselves about with kindly deeds, so live as to win the respect of all, and when under the sod live in the eyes and mouths of men. Too soon the whistle sounded, and we had to say goodbye, which we did in an enthusiasm that told how deeply we felt. We were walking in the Primrose Way. Its flowers and songs were sweet, and we thought their perfume and melody eternal. I again arrived in Paris at daylight, but early as it was, my sweetheart, escorted by my servant, was waiting my arrival. It was our wedding morning. During our drive to the hotel, radiant with joy, she told me the separation had been a cruel one, and she was so happy to know we should never be separated again. At 4 o'clock that afternoon we were married at the American Embassy. I had told everyone I was going to leave the next day for Havre to embark for New York. Our baggage was all packed and placed in a van, which I accompanied to the Havre station and had stored there. Sunday I purchased 1 ticket to Bayonne, 1 for Madrid, and 1 to Burgos, each from different agencies. On Sunday morning, I took a van to the Havre station, and transferring our baggage to the road into Spain, checked all of it to Madrid. My purpose was to sail by the Lopez & Co. steamer El Rey Felipe from Cadiz to Mexico, which was advertised to sail 10 days later. We were married very quietly on Friday, and our friends, wisely recognizing the fact that young married people like to be alone, the next day said goodbye and returned to Normandy. We spent a quiet and happy Saturday and Sunday, and on Sunday night we left, my wife, servant, and self, for Cadiz via Madrid. My wife, like all English people, knew little of geography, and had such hazy notions of America that she thought it quite the thing to go to such an outlandish and far-off quarter of the globe as America via a Spanish port. Columbus, she knew, had gone that way, and why should not we? We had an all-night ride to Bayonne in one of those antiquated compartments used in railway carriages all over Europe. But the ride was not tedious, nor was the night long. This little earth had no happier couple, and talking of the happy years that lay before us, the night rushed by like a fairy dream. Where was my conscience? Why, my dear reader, I had sung it such a song that it was delighted with the music, and had, I was going to say, gone to sleep, but it had not. It was wide awake, and we were good chums. We both, Conscience and I, had persuaded ourselves it was a virtuous deed to do evil that good might come. My conscience was perhaps as old as the sun, but I myself was young and too inexperienced to see the fallacy of the argument, since I myself was the doer of the wrong. But of course I should have hotly denounced any other such philosopher as a villain and rogue. The night flew by, and to our surprise we found 240 miles had slipped away, and we were in Bayonne. 30 minutes more, and we were speeding south, and soon crossed the Bidassoa, the boundary between France and Spain. Then my wife, saying, "Now I will sleep," laid her head on the shoulder of the happiest man in or out of Spain, and in 10 minutes her regular breathing told me she was in the land of dreams. The Pyrenees, in dividing France and Spain, stand between 2 distinct peoples, and as the centuries go by the streams of national life meet, but only to repel each other, never to mingle. One has but to cross the bank to realize that he is among a different race. Dress, food, and cooking. social life, religious devotion, modes of thought, are all different. To us here in America, it is difficult to realize that so slight a thing as a mountain barrier, easily traversed, crossed by many defiles and good roads, should continue to separate two distinct peoples. But so it is. Stranger still, for nearly all time the inhabitants of the Spanish mountains have been more or less opposed to the people of the Spanish plains, and every century has seen several insurrections among the mountaineers. In 1872 and 73, the Carlists held the mountains and more or less fusillading was going on. The possibility of my way being blocked by the Carlists never entered into my calculations. The railway from Bayonne to Madrid is owned in Paris, and it seemed that the directors were paying blackmail to Don Carlos, ostensibly to him, but really to several marauding bands who plundered under the name of fighting for the Don, upon the understanding that the railroad was not to be meddled with. The directors had been paying 100,000 francs a month. As will be easily believed, there was a difficulty in the distribution of the money among so many greedy and inartistic robbers, and the discontented determined to hold up the railroad itself and stop all trains. Unluckily, the train we were on was the one they proposed to experiment on first, and they proposed drastic measures too. In fact, had blown up or down a short tunnel and torn up the rails in front of our train. As we crossed the frontier, a French gendarme and Spanish civil guard appeared, demanding passports. It was, of course, a sure thing that I had them all right. It is a safeguard under the protection of which the man who has anything to fear slips through the fingers of frontier guards and police, while the honest man quite frequently neglects the necessary formalities and is detained. Our train crossed the bridge over the Bidassoa, and we were on Spanish soil. Soon we entered the gorges of the Pyrenees, and while speculating whether I should awaken my wife to see the magnificent scenery, all necessity for awakening anyone on that train was over. 3 or 4 musket shots rang out. Our train was off the rail, and after a crash or two came to a sudden stop, and then a babel arose, while the train was surrounded by armed men. It was laughable. It seemed like an opera bouffe, the real thing, this motley array of brigands, all trying to maintain under difficulties the grave Spanish exterior. One monkey of 18 or 19 years, armed, came to our compartment, and, pointing to my chain, said he wanted it, and my watch. None of us understood Spanish, but we all comprehended his meaning readily. I refused to make him a gift, and got rid of him easily. We were all ordered to alight, and our captors seemed inclined to be ugly. Myself and party were about the only well-dressed people on the train, and, seeing a priest close by, I went up to him, and ascertaining he could speak French, I began, in very bad French indeed, to threaten with very dire consequences Don Carlos and every band of Carlists who dares to annoy an English Duke and Duchess, and demanded instant shelter and a guard for my wife, the Duchess. We could hardly keep from laughing, it was so very like a melodrama. My wife thoroughly enjoyed the situation, and I should have done so too, had I not had such strong reasons for quick passage through Spain to blue water on the south, for I desired to speedily put some leagues of Neptune's domain between myself and the old world. The priest, although a sallow, sombre fellow, was a very good one, and seemed to realize the gravity of the situation, for, calling the chief to him, he warned him to be careful. That gentleman came up, and drawing himself up said very proudly, "Sir, we are soldiers, not robbers." I said I was very glad to know it, and demanded to be informed if I was a prisoner or not, and was told I was not, but with the same breath he said he would be obliged to detain us for a few days. There was a fonda, or inn, close by, and leaving my wife there, I finally managed by a liberal use of money to secure an ox cart, and by virtue of great generalship on the part of myself and servant, got all our baggage out of the wrecked train and safely up to the inn. Spaniards are provokingly slow, but by riding mule back 5 miles away, I succeeded in seeing the local commander of the Carlist forces, and he promised to send me the next day a pass through the lines, going either south or north. I got him also to include in the pass my fellow passengers. I did this because there was a Portuguese family who had tickets for South America. They were then on their way to embark at Lisbon, and the old gentleman, the head of the family, was very weak and ill. My safe plan would have been to return to France, make my way to Brest and embark from there to New York, and that would have been my course had I had any conception of the slowness of the Spanish officials and of the fierce storms and snows that dominate the passes of the Pyrenees in winter. We were informed by many officials, railway guards, custom-house officers, Carlists, and so on, that by crossing 30 miles south we would pass the lines and get to a little town on the railway where trains left frequently for Madrid. The Spaniards about the place would never have let us start out on that perilous trip, had it not been for the money there was in it. I had secured at a round price 3-century-old bullock carts, and in the afternoon of the second day we got off. I had all the women and the sick Portuguese in one cart, with the 2 other carts ahead heaped with luggage. Thus there were 8 bullocks, 4 mules, and, unlucky number, 13 men engaged. I had very misty notions as to our destination, but took it for granted the baker's dozen of natives I had with me knew what they were about. Snow was everywhere, and we were mounting up, up, up on wheels, but I suppose the highest altitude was only 4 or 5 miles away, and that the downgrade would be easy until we reached some snug inn where we would find shelter for man and beast. Then an early start by daylight, and our novel jaunt would come to an end in civilization and a railway. But I did not know Spaniards, their country, the Pyrenees, nor what blizzards can blow in sunny Spain. Myself and my servant nun trudged on alongside the cart with the women. It took an hour to get out of sight of the fonda, and then we struck a fine, wide military road that wound in and around the mountains, but always up and deep in snow. 3-4 o'clock came, and still no sign of the summit, but with the road winding in and out for miles ahead. The sky began to darken, and without warning down came the snow. Then frequent halts of the caravan to rest the cattle. Deeper grew the snow, and as the darkness began to settle down, I realized the responsibility I had unwittingly taken on my shoulders. I had 4 delicate women in my forlorn party, and found myself fast in the midst of a snowstorm in a wild pass of the Pyrenees. I recognized one blessing, however, and was profoundly grateful. The air was calm, and though the snow fell thick and fast, it was not driven by a storm. And Nun proved to be thoroughly reliable, helpful and full of cheer. Between us we kept up the spirits of the party. But all hands began to grow hungry. Fortunately, I had in my baggage a large pate de foie gras. That is a fat goose liver pie, and it was fat, happily so, as it went the further. Then I got rugs and wraps out of my trunks for the women, and a couple of bottles of brandy, and administered liberal doses all round. I soon had them happy and full of courage. It was certainly better to have them full of Dutch courage in a fool's paradise than to have them awake to their position, for I quite expected it would end in a night camp, out in the snow, and sending an empty cart for supplies. 2 hours after dark we came to a dead halt, and my guides, they were beauties, said they could go no further. The oxen could not pull the carts. There was a fonda, they said, 2 miles away, but did not show any disposition to help to get there, and for that matter did not seem to care whether we did or not. I ordered them to leave the middle cart behind and divide the teams, one team to be added to the front cart and one to be hitched in front of the mules. Our interpreter was one of the Portuguese women, but we did not get on very well. The Spaniards objecting to anything being done, all of them apparently waiting for the Virgin or some of the saints to come to our aid, but as neither did, Nun and I were exasperated and finally took the matter into our own hands. By my orders, despite the energetic protests of the drivers, he unhitched the oxen from the middle team, and between us we got them to the mule cart, hitched them in front of the mules, and pulled out and past the other carts. Here the Spaniards halted us, and after an angry altercation in the dark, and it was dark, they agreed to go on. So, taking a yoke of oxen from our cart, they were put in front of the 4 of the first cart, and off we started. None volunteered to stand by and guard the stranded cart, so giving him 2 blankets and a little brandy we drove off in the darkness. But not until, in sight of all, I had given him a revolver, and each of the unlucky 13 a good nip of brandy. My anxiety about serious results was over as soon we started, and in an hour and a half we halted in front of a wretched mountain inn, patronized by muleteers, with the first story for a stable, but none of us were disposed to be particular. A supper of Spanish beans was soon ready, and then a bed was made up on the floor, and the women were soon asleep. After seeing that the mules and oxen were fed, I took half an hour's nap. Then, with 2 drivers, we started back, taking 3 yoke of oxen. What a tramp I had back through the snow and storm! I was very happy, however, for I knew my wife and party were safely sheltered, and the excitement of action kept one from being gloomy. In due time we found our stray, hitched to and started, but it was hard pulling, and the exhausted oxen had to come to frequent halts. At last, just as I was beginning to feel tired, we came to the fonda. The snow had slackened, but the wind was beginning to blow, so Nun and I carried all the luggage and traps into a corner of the stable below, and tumbling down into the hay we were soon in the land of dreams. In my dreams I was on a shoreless sea, in a bark that silently and swiftly circled around. Dark clouds closed in on all sides, while my boat sailed between ever-narrowing walls, the clouds still closing in until a giant hand grew out from a ragged edge of the cloud wall, which, seizing the prow of my boat, pulled it into the gloom and darkness. I felt the clouds brushing my cheek. I heard the roar of falling water and felt that my doom was sealed. I thought of my wife, and, trying to call her name, was dumb. I looked behind. Far off and far up there was a glow of rosy light, and within the aureole was her face, full of sorrow, looking at me with pity in every feature. As I looked, her face was slowly eclipsed by a cloud. Then with one cry, I plunged into the sea and awoke. That dream would easily have joined the long procession of forgotten dreams, but it was recalled many a time during many years. And, try as I might, I felt it to be a portent and a prophecy. When I awoke in the morning, I was dumbfounded to find a blizzard blowing that the cattle could not face, and with every appearance of continuance. In reply to my inquiries, I learned they sometimes blew in those altitudes for a week. This was unpleasant news for me, and the prospect made me nervous. It was now Thursday, the 4th day since our departure from Paris. And what might have happened in London in that time? Here was I as completely isolated from the outside world, and from all news about my companions in England, as if on a desert isle. For all I knew, discovery might have been made, and full details of the fraud might be blazing in the press of Europe. I began to fear I had run into a trap. To make matters worse, the steamer El Rey Felipe was advertised to sail Monday from Cadiz, and to miss her seemed danger indeed. I was a prisoner in a wretched inn in a defile of the Pyrenees, with a civil war raging, and no telling what might arise to detain us. Our objective point was only some 35 miles away. But with roads deep in snow, with wretched cattle and more wretched Spaniards for drivers, there was poor prospect of making headway. I felt it would never do for me to suffer longer detention. I determined to leave my wife and baggage in charge of none, to put the 120,000 I had in a bag and start back to the French frontier, cross into France and catch the Saturday steamer from Havre to New York, explaining to my wife that important business demanded my presence in America, that she could follow on the next steamer and that I would meet her on arrival. In the meantime, my unlucky 13 were happy. For were they not sheltered, with plenty of food and high wages, all out of the pocket of the great Lord, the Virgin herself must have sent to them? In fact, they were winning from me what to them was a fortune. I was paying each man $1 a day and 5 by each team and cart. From my experience, I must give the Spaniards a good name for honesty. Of course, they were charging me cutthroat prices, but they were poor, and wealthy lords did not often come their way. Aside from that, they were very honest. Many things, such as rugs, shawls, lunch baskets, dressing cases, and so on, that must have seemed of value to them, lay around everywhere. But not a single article was missing during the entire trip. All day long the blizzard blew. It was a novel situation. And how I should have enjoyed it had I only possessed that greatest of all blessings, a good conscience. As it was, I was in misery, and could find no peace, not even in my wife's smiles and evident content to be anywhere with me. I saw that the cattle were well cared for, and that the men had both food and wine. Then my servant skirmished around and decapitated sundry chickens he found. So we had roast chicken 3 times a day, and as I had a case of brandy in my luggage, we did not suffer. None roasted the chickens, made the punch, got the Spanish men and women to dance for our entertainment, and made himself generally of service. About midnight, the storm broke up, and to my great satisfaction the stars came out. That night I slept in the same room with the women, with a sheet hung between us. At 5 o'clock I had all hands up and breakfast under way. I ordered the drivers and hangers-on to have the teams hitched up and ready at daylight. They all ate breakfast heartily enough, but were not zealous about starting out. They made all sorts of pretexts and excuses to avoid leaving their comfortable quarters. Certainly the road was not an inviting prospect, there being quite 18 inches of snow, but I was determined to start one way or the other, either south with the party or north alone. After long argument they, thinking they had me at their mercy, refused to hitch up the cattle to make the attempt. I at once paid and dismissed them all, determining to set out immediately alone for the French frontier, carrying only a small bag slung over my shoulder and concealing the bonds and paper money on my person. I would leave the greater part of the gold in charge of my wife. I knew none would be a trusty guard to her. I had not given her any intimation of my purpose, but got my bag ready, and, secreting about me the bonds and paper money, I took my wife into a room, and, first telling her she must be very brave, explained my plan, pointing out I must not miss the Saturday steamer. She should follow on the next, and I would leave her 20,000. But she pleaded to go with me, said she would be no encumbrance, would ride mule back to the railway, no matter how far away. I then called Nunn and told him I should leave him in charge of the baggage and that we were going to set out at once. I praised his fidelity and informed him I would make him a present when he arrived all safe in New York with the baggage. But when the sick man and his family were told we were going, they raised a howl. The women all hung on me crying and imploring me not to leave them to despair and death. They would all perish, and so on. I had secured a good saddle mule, but with a man's saddle, and my wife was sensible enough not to make an outcry over the prospect of a ride-man. Fashion. She came out warmly clad and mounted the mule, and I strapped some rugs and a bundle of lunch behind the saddle. The owner of the mule was at his head, halter in hand, ready to lead off. The entire population were out staring open-mouthed. I delivered a speech to my unlucky 13, telling them in the best way I could that I was going in order to deliver them all over to the vengeance of the military chief of the district. That I should accuse them as robbers and thieves, and that they might look for anguish that would wring their hearts and souls. They were greatly moved, and, pulling out my watch, I informed them by pantomime and bad Spanish that if they got the teams in harness and the luggage all packed on the carts in 20 minutes, I would take them into my favour and resume our journey southward. Spaniards are proverbially slow. But these Spaniards were not slow, and a very few minutes saw us all once more mounted on our cart, with the 2 baggage carts following, and on our rocky way southward. Chapter 28. Fear, SAYSNOTO happiness. We passed during the day a military post and several squads of armed men. Poor fellows. They were wretchedly equipped, so far as garments went. They all examined us curiously, but did not offer to stop or question us while I marched on ahead of the cavalcade like a drum major, giving the military salute to each party as we passed. I ought to have been fatigued, but I was not. After about 5 miles of uphill work, we began to descend. The road was a masterpiece of engineering, and well it might be, for it was one of 5 military roads, the great Napoleon ordered to be constructed across the Pyrenees, and it was done in a thoroughly workmanlike manner. It wound in and out and along defiles of stern beauty. We halted for rest and refreshment at noon, and again at 4 o'clock for an hour. At the last place we found some Carlist officers, one a young Englishman, who was a good fellow and most attentive. He was an aide de camp on Don Carlos's staff. He told me there was no chance of his side winning, but he was in it for the fun of the thing, and in hope of seeing some fighting. He had taken part in a number of skirmishes, and was by no means satisfied yet. He volunteered to escort us through the lines, and was evidently more than pleased to meet an English lady in the person of my wife. It was beautiful to see him order about my muleteers and bully them up hill and down dale, not hesitating to use his whip on them. About 5 o'clock we started off in great shape, having some 20 miles to go to the little town on the railway south of the Pyrenees. We had 2 lanterns and a number of torches. It was a picturesque caravan in the darkness. The young officer rode beside the first cart, conversing with my wife, while I walked in the rear. We had reason to congratulate ourselves over our escort, he being a brave and brilliant fellow, and evidently a person of importance. He little thought whom he was escorting. I was pleased on my wife's account, as he was company for her, and, altogether, she thoroughly enjoyed the novelty of the whole situation. We had made a fine bed of hay and blankets for our sick man. Nevertheless, he was a source of much anxiety and trouble. At last, to the intense relief of all, we heard far away the shrill whistle of a locomotive. It was sweet music to my ears, for I realized the peril of the delay. We had now arrived at the base of the southern slope of the Pyrenees, and the plain stretched out before us. We had just passed through an entrenched camp that guarded the entrance to the valley. Our escort had ridden ahead, and not satisfied with smoothing the way for us, had turned out the guard to do us honour. We halted for a few minutes, and several uniformed officers came forward and were introduced to my wife and me. It was a picturesque scene. The mantle of snow covering all, the strange-looking mountaineers, the eager-faced boyish officers, French, English, Austrian, all soldiers of fortune who, in the dearth of great wars, were seeking fame in the inglorious civil contest, our torches casting fantastic shadows until the forest-covered mountain, dark and frowning, though snow lay everywhere, seemed peopled with hosts of men. All made a picture never to be forgotten by some of the observers. Another mile and our escort had to leave us, but the town, standing dark against the snow, was in plain view. By his advice, I went ahead on foot with 2 men, in case any of the enemy were prowling around, but found none until we arrived in the town. Then a scene of great excitement to the townspeople arose. We were examined and cross-examined, and our statements taken down in writing and sworn to by all hands. In the meantime, I had made beds for our sick man and the ladies in the waiting room of the station, and about 2 o'clock I went to sleep. The station was fortified and full of soldiers, but I did not care, being told the Madrid train would start at daylight. If so, I would be in time for El Rey Felipe and would be sailing out of Cadiz harbour on Monday over the blue water, westward ho. After a 2 hours nap I was up, paid off my lucky 13, giving them a present in addition to their due, with a written paper certifying that they were honest and brave and had delivered me and mine in safety. The weather continued very cold, and when the train, consisting of 2 passenger and 1 baggage car, arrived, we found there were no heating arrangements, and we shivered at the thought of an all-day's ride without fire or heat across that windy plain. I determined to have a compartment to ourselves, for my wife and I had not had a moment's privacy since the smash-up of the train. So we fixed up a bed on the floor of a compartment for our sick man, and I put his family in to look out for him. When the train left, we found ourselves, very much to our satisfaction, alone. I had telegraphed ahead to Burgess to have hot water cases, then the only mode of heating cars in Europe, ready on our arrival. The engineer of our train was an Englishman. As it was so important that I should not be delayed, I gave him a sovereign and his stoker another, and asked him as a favour to make time. He said he would, and kept his word. But arriving at Burgos, we found that the train from Santander going south was 2 hours late, so my wife and I started out to see the famous town. After a short view, we made our way to the cathedral, and it was a sight. It is one of the many sacred edifices which the piety of former ages bequeathed our own. One of these sacred buildings, like the Strasbourg and Cologne cathedrals, in the construction of which generation after generation of pious souls, pious according to the fashion of their times, had given their days to the building and decoration of the cloister or church where their lives were lived, and all was done with loving and patient care. We in our day may sneer at the monks and brothers of the Dark Ages, but in those times of rude violence all gentle-hearted, scholarly souls found in the sanctity and quiet of the cloister the only refuge open to them, and they did good work, both in the domain of mind and in the world of material things. Much that was piety, and much that was faith in their day is termed superstition in ours. But who will deny that the simple piety and credulous faith of their day was 1,000,000 times better than the restless scepticism and sad unrest of ours? At Burgos I tried to get an English paper, but none was to be had, and no one there had ever seen one. But here some startling news came flashing over the wires, nothing less than that there had been a revolution at Madrid, the capital. Amadeo, the lately elected king, had suddenly resigned, and a republic had been proclaimed with Costler at the head. I began to see more and more what a fool I was to let myself be caught at such a time in such a land, but still had so much confidence in my good fortune that I felt I would be on time for the steamer on Monday. It was now 3 o'clock Friday. We were all aboard for Madrid and just pulling out of the station. We would be due there the next morning. From Madrid to Cadiz there is only one through train in 24 hours, and that leaves 7 mornings a week. But, as it runs only 15 miles an hour and is seldom on time at that, one must figure on taking an entire 24 hours for the journey. Still, as we would be due Saturday morning, I had a big margin for delay. At last we were off. On the train, and in every group we passed, there were signs of subdued excitement. Between Royalists and Republicans, sharp lines were evidently drawn, which soon were to culminate in bloody conflict. Soon after 10 o'clock we arrived in the walled town of Avila, about 80 miles from the famous Escurial built by the second Philip, and about 150 miles from Madrid. Here we got an excellent dinner and good coffee. But dinner was spoiled for me by the disastrous intelligence that martial law had been proclaimed, and that the government had seized the roads running north from Madrid to transport troops. Here was a pretty pickle. I was enraged. I saw the chief of the railway at Avila, but he was a fool, and under the unwanted state of affairs had lost what little head he ever had. So once more our baggage was all piled out of the train, and once more we had to go into camp on the floor of the station with a terrific din around us. I arose early, and looking up the telegraph clerk and railway chief, I made them both rich by the present to each of 5 escudos. Then I telegraphed Castler and the Minister of War that I was an Englishman, that I had my family with me, and having important business in Madrid, I must not be detained in Avila. I demanded that he should at once direct the military officials to send me on to Madrid by special train. I also sent a telegram to Hernandez, president of the road in Paris, offering 5,000 francs for a special train. Another urgent message was sent to the superintendent in Madrid, repeating the offer for a special train, the same sum to himself if he expedited the train. I also authorized him to spend a similar amount, if necessary, in bribing the military authorities. At 11 o'clock, I had a long telegram from him saying a train would be made up at Avila. But an hour having passed away, I sent him a message to order up an engine and one car from Madrid. Another message arrived at 12 o'clock, and down came an engine and car. Our baggage was hustled into the 3 front compartments. I put Nun and the Portuguese party in one, and my wife and I occupied the rear compartment. Thank heaven, once more alone together. The soldiers and inhabitants flocked around, and we were the observed of all observers. The local railway chief was more than anxious to see us off, as I added another 5 to the 5 escudos already given. Just then, the telegraph operator flew out with an order for our train to await the arrival of the train from Madrid. I stormed. I kept the wire hot with messages of protest to officials. 2 messages came from Madrid saying the delay was but temporary. So there I sat in that musty compartment, my wife by my side, and with a heart full of bitterness, for I saw the precious hours slipping away, and with them my chance of taking the Sunday morning train so as to catch the Cadiz steamer. To miss it, I thought, meant ruin. Hour after hour passed by, and there we sat. My secret cause of unrest had to be kept locked in my breast, while my young wife, all unsuspecting, was merry and happy, chanting little snatches of song and telling me 100 times she was the happiest of women. She did not care for revolutions nor for delays. Was she not with me? The sun began to go down the sky, and the shadows fell. Still we sat on, expecting every moment an order to proceed. The suspense was terrible. At last, about 6 o'clock, an order came to have everything ready to pull out for Madrid at 7, so very reluctantly we dismounted to take supper in the station, and once more got into the car. But no order came. The hours dragged on, and I saw fate closing her hand on me. The night wore on, when suddenly, toward midnight, the operator rushed out of his office and, shouting to the engineer, flew up to our compartment, said goodbye, and in a minute we were off. After that long and terrible day, it was happiness to be moving. I had given the engineer a tip. He put on steam, and as we flew over the road, hope returned. I felt we were safe. At the rate we were going, I should have 2 or 3 hours to spare. We soon were at the Escurial. As fate would have it, we found here an order to run us on a side line and to keep the track clear for a train going north. For 2 miserable hours we waited, and no train. Then I set the wires in motion again, and just as the eastern skies grew grey, we started. Soon after midnight, I telegraphed to the railway authorities at Madrid to hold the train going south to Cadiz until my arrival, offering 100 an hour for every hour's detention. Madrid is situated on a high sandy plain, storm-swept in winter, worse than any plains in northern Europe. We had a wheezy engine. 4 miles out it broke down, and then I gave up the struggle. At 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, 9 hours too late for the Cadiz train, we arrived at Madrid, too late to reach Cadiz by a special train. Not too late could the train have been started off as soon as ordered, but in Spain a special train is an unheard of thing. Mine from Avila was an innovation, only possible because there was so much money behind it to all concerned at both ends of the line. No Spaniard was ever known to be in a hurry, and no particle of matter between his chin and his sombrero holds any lurking suspicion that anything born of a woman could be in a hurry, or have any reason for any such insanity. Here I was at last in the much-longed-for Madrid, but not on time, and I had nothing to do but to put in execution some new plan. Had I even at that late date resolved to go to New York, I could have returned to France by the eastern route, via Barcelona, and all might have been well. I telegraphed to Lopez and Co., to Cadiz, inquiring if they would hold the El Rey Felipe for 20 hours. They replied they were under contract with the government and had to sail on time. So I said goodbye to that plan. On consulting my memorandum, I saw there was a French steamer sailing from Saint-Nazaire on the west coast of France for Vera Cruz, Mexico, which would touch at Santander on Saturday for mails and passengers, and I resolved to go by her. This, of course, meant retracing our way through the hated Avila to Burgos and changing there for Santander. Here we saw the last of the Portuguese family with their sick member. They said goodbye with every expression of gratitude, and in truth I was glad to see them off. We were all very tired of them, and they had been a serious expense. That is, might have been serious. But as I paid that expense out of the Bank of England's cash, I naturally could be liberal in the extreme, and gave a salve to my conscience by reflecting what a good-souled, charitable young man I was in looking out for these strangers, and putting my hand freely in my pocket in their behalf. As soon as breakfast was over, I hurried to the English embassy, and there, securing files of the London papers, looked eagerly and nervously through them. To my intense relief, I saw there was nothing in them. Therefore, I knew all was serene in London, and that the old lady was without doubt giving out sovereigns by the tens of thousands for us. Very much relieved in mind, I returned to the hotel, and we set out to see Madrid. Chapter XXIX. I watched The Pyrenees, SINKINTHESEA, sail OR Green, Neptune's BACK. It was 11 o'clock when we started. The streets were thronged, and the throngs moving in one direction. That was to the street lined on both sides with churches, whose doors were flung wide open to the surging masses. We went with the current and entered a famous church which was crowded with the pious, their souls wrapped in their devotion. Like all European churches, there were no seats, but the audience, closely packed, knelt or stood. We joined the worshippers but looked around with curious eyes. When the prayers were ended, the street was one living mass of people, all moving toward the outskirts of the town. We went with the tide, and with the tide entered the arena, where a bullfight was on, curious transition from church to arena. It was a great sight, I mean that of seeing the people. There were 15,000 present in that amphitheatre. It looked just like the old Roman arena, and to us was in all its details intensely interesting. On Monday we visited the picture galleries and museums, and on Tuesday we got our baggage down to the depot once more, and purchasing our tickets we were off for Santander. I was too anxious to enjoy the scenery. We were a day and a night on the journey, and arriving on Wednesday I still had before me 3 days of anxiety. Being thoroughly sick of Spain, I longed to be on blue water with our good ship's prow pointed to the western world. Then I felt I could begin to enjoy life. I had a charming wife, delightful companion, and once up anchor all my haunting fears would die, and life's pleasures would be mine to the full. But there in Santander the time dragged wearily. To be sure, I had the English papers, but they were nearly a week on the way, and a bad conscience finds many a cause for fear. I was aching to be aboard. Saturday came at last, and going early down to the headland at the harbour's mouth, with my field glass I anxiously scanned the Bay of Biscay to see if I could discern anywhere on the horizon the smoke of the approaching steamer. Lingering there until the dinner hour, I hastened to the hotel. My wife was merry and happy. I was glad to see her so, and found it difficult to conceal my solicitude. Going both together to the headland, we spent most of the afternoon there. Night and then midnight came, and no steamer's lights flashed in the dark waters of the bay. Heartsick and anxious, I went to bed, half resolved to take my wife into my confidence, tell her in some measure the truth, and point out to her the necessity of my taking flight, leaving her to follow at her leisure. It would have been a terrible shock to her, but I began to fear that the truth would come to her ears some time. Early the next morning my servant awoke me, asking me to look out of the window. I ran to it, and looking out, there in the bay, just in front of the hotel, lay a steamer of the largest size and magnificent in her beauty. It was a happy sight for me. A nun hired a boat for our luggage, and a second for me, and then, after a hurried breakfast, we boarded the steamer, Nun following with the baggage. Among other things, I had a favourite dressing case, and had given the servant strict orders to keep it under his eye, but as soon as he came aboard he inquired in great agitation if I had brought it off with me. Upon my saying no, he was quite overcome, at the same time explaining that he had laid it on top of the baggage in front of the hotel, and someone had stolen it. While he was speaking, a passenger came walking by with the identical case in his hand. Nun flew at the man and seized both him and the bag, and sure enough he had the thief, but I ordered him to let the man go, and he went away shamefaced enough. He little thought when stealing the bag that the owner was going on the same steamer. At last we were afloat, and now I was all eagerness to hear the steam monkey start to bring the anchor apeak. It is simply amazing how a bad conscience mouldeth goblins swift as frenzy's thought. Even as I stood there, I was not at rest, but was impatient and suspicious of every movement from the shore. As the long day dragged slowly on and 4 o'clock came, preparations for getting under way were going rapidly forward. I took my field glasses, stationed myself on the afterdeck, and anxiously scrutinized every boat leaving the shore. Suddenly, a boat started out from the head of the bay, pulled steadily by 8 rowers, and my conscience told me it meant danger, but the boatmen pulled down along the shore, then suddenly stopped, and I could see that they were passing a bottle around, taking a drink. Soon I discovered a heap on the stern, which on closer inspection proved to be nets, and my fears boiled down showed me they were simply fishermen, and I an arse, and somewhat ashamed of myself. I felt I had really no cause for fear, even had the steamer remained in harbour for a week. Just then, with a mighty throb, the screw gave a turn, and it was music to my ears. Then the waters of the bay were churned into yeasty waves. The city and shores seemed to glide by, and our prow was pointed direct to the blue sea rolling beyond. Soon the joyous billows were toying with our ship, and huge as it was, were tossing it as lightly and easily as a child a toy. But, still ill at ease, I walked the deck restless and unhappy. I no longer feared arrest, was confident that never would hand of human justice be laid on me, but I dimly felt that there was a divine justice which would exact retribution. I felt that if there was mind behind this frame of matter we see, then he who made the natural law and decreed a penalty for every infraction must have made an infallible decree for every violation against the moral law. If so, where could we poor insects go or hide, or how scheme or dodge to escape the divine vengeance? But as I stood on the deck that night and watched the mountains sink into the sea, I felt this all dimly and tried to shake off the feeling. I stood fascinated, with many conflicting emotions sweeping through my mind, sadly watching the receding shores of Spain, and just as the highest mountains were sinking in the sea, my servant appearing at my side informed me that dinner was ready and my wife waiting. Sending him away and turning my face to the land, I strained my eyes through the gathering gloom to discern the distant shore. Then, with a bitter feeling in my heart, I set out for the saloon, but stopped, and quoting these lines, "The day of my destiny is over, and the star of my fate hath declined," went below. Soon, under the warming influence of wine, forgetting all my forebodings and looking into my wife's face beaming with love and content, I could not refrain from saying to myself, I am a fool to doubt that happiness is mine. Am I not fortune's favourite? With love, youth, enthusiasm, health and wealth on my side, what else save happy days and nights and long years filled with content can be mine? So, shaking off my forebodings, the 18 days of our voyage over green Neptune's back were ideal, and we became objects of envy to all the passengers. Our ship was the Martinique, with French officers and crew, and a fine, manly lot of men they were. The passengers were mostly colonial people returning home to the French colonies in the West Indies. They were nice, refined people, but we were rather reserved and kept to ourselves. One of the passengers had a dozen Spanish fighting cocks, and they afforded us much amusement. There were frequent mains on the afterdeck, and sometimes on the dinner table. These were very popular, particularly with the ladies, who were continually asking to have the cocks brought on after dessert. A space would be made in the centre of the table, and 2 cocks placed on it. How they loved fighting! They certainly enjoyed it far better than the spectators. There were 4 long tables, all crowded, but when the main was started, the other tables were deserted and the passengers packed around ours. Our opposite neighbours were 2 sisters of charity, who were on their way to the city of Mexico to fill a gap that death had made in the ranks of their order there. They were simple, sainted souls, and had never known any life other than the religious, and never emerged from the cloister, save only to do deeds of mercy in the country town outside. They had been selected by lot to go to Mexico. We were favoured to become fast friends of theirs, and I was glad to have them accept such attentions as we could give. It was delightful to meet such simple, unsophisticated people under circumstances when, they being travellers, the rules of the church permitted them to throw off their reserve, to associate with strangers and to live, so far as food and drink were concerned, like the people they were associated with for the time. My wife and I grew to like them well, and I was never tired of getting their views of men and things. Truly, their lives were a thing apart from the world and the ways of men. They told me with a kind of rapture that the average life of one of their order in Mexico was only 5 years, and they thought heaven had been very gracious in selecting them, that they might give their lives to the church and so become members of the mighty army of martyrs who were honoured in heaven by looking upon the face of the Virgin and her Son and serving them. They knew nothing of wines and did not suspect the costliness of those which during the entire voyage they drank at my expense. The dinners were rather formal affairs and occupied an hour and a half, and between the good sisters and us two, we always finished a bottle of claret and two of champagne, and about a like quantity between dinner and bedtime. I don't believe that up to the hour they left the world they ever quite understood why they were so happy and merry on that voyage. We used to visit the steerage Forward nearly every day. There was an unmistakable lady so unfortunate as to be a passenger there. She appreciated our visits and eventually confided the story of her life to my wife, and what a story it was of woman's love and man's perfidy. I had an electric battery which I frequently took into the steerage to astonish the natives. When I first put a silver piece in a basin of water and told them the man taking it out could keep it, what a rush there was. There was one would-be clever clown who was perfectly willing to test the power of the battery, but was so clever he never would take hold of both handles at once. He dodged around for 2 or 3 days, greatly pleased with his sharpness, but I determined to have him some day and have him hard when I got him. So one morning, when dancing about as usual, he happened to be barefooted. Apparently by accident, I upset the basin of water over the deck, making it a good conductor. Then, accepting his offer to try the machine by holding one handle, I dropped the other on the wet deck and gave him the benefit of the whole power of the battery. He let one terrific yell, then stood rooted to the deck speechless for a moment, then gave vent to a series of whoops that would have made the fortune of a Comanche Indian. When freed from the current, the clever fellow made a break for the steerage and never appeared again at any of my electric seances. All those ignorants insisted that my battery was surely El Diablo. After 18 days, we cast anchor in St. Thomas Harbour, and pleasant as our voyage had been, we were glad to see land. We were to stop a day for coaling. Taking the 2 sisters, we went ashore in one of the many boats surrounding the ship, all manned by scantily robed black fellows. The town, with its hordes of gaudily dressed and noisy blacks, was most interesting. I had hired the boat for the day, so the 3 black fellows accompanied us around the town. Each wore a stovepipe hat. The remainder of their furniture consisted of cotton shirt and trousers. The men were barefooted, of course. My wife was the typical blue-eyed, golden-haired Englishwoman, and was the observed of all observers in that black mob. I myself was all in white, from canvas shoes to white umbrella. So, between the 2 sisters in their black robes and white bonnets, and our attending boatman, along with a mob of half-naked black boys that followed, we formed quite a circus and created a commotion in the town. First, I took the sisters to the cathedral. Both were grateful and knelt at the altar for a full half-hour while we waited. Then, after visiting several stores to make some small purchases, we went to a circus showing there that week. I bought 10 tickets for my party. Everything they saw in the town was marvellous and strange to them. When we entered the circus tent, the sisters were perplexed and thought it must be a new sort of church. No words would fail to express their amazement when they saw the clown and bespangled horseman enter the ring and the performance begin. They were in a new and hitherto undreamed of world, and gazed in childlike wonderment on the scene, and, like children, only saw the glitter of the spangles, and thought both men and women performers were angels of beauty. Even after the thing was over, the magic and witchery of it all rested on them. Their hearts were deeply stirred, and their thoughts were with the performers. To please them, we sat until the audience had dispersed, and, when going out, one of them, speaking of the performers, told my wife they must be very near to God. Then we went to the hotel. I dispersed my cortege and ordered a room for ourselves and one for the sisters, and we all took a nap until evening. Then we had some negroes singing and dancing for our amusement in the courtyard of the hotel, and at 9 o'clock we went out for a moonlight walk under the tropical sky. About 10 we found we had had enough of it, and were glad to betake ourselves to bed. We all breakfasted together in the courtyard the next morning, and soon after went aboard. At noon up came the anchor, and we were off for Havana, our next stopping place, 24 hours sail away. The steamer, after 1 day's detention to take in cargo, would continue her voyage to Vera Cruz. It was my intention to go on to that port, and from there across the country to the capital, the city of Mexico. There was no cable to Mexico in 1873, and things there were in rather a primitive condition. Of course, I never anticipated pursuit beyond New York, and took it for granted that my friends at police headquarters would squelch it there. But once in Mexico, there would have been no danger for me. To be in Mexico was like being in the center of darkest Africa. There was no extradition treaty, no railroads, and no telegraph. Above all, I had plenty of cash. I intended to buy an estate near the capital and settle down for 2 or 3 years, and by a liberal expenditure of money secure the friendship of the government officials and the chief people of the country. Official and social morals being not of the best. If my history transpired, I would probably become the lion of society, as they would all esteem it a creditable thing to any man to secure a few millions from the English, whose enormous wealth is the plunder of India and all the world for centuries. The next morning, I found we were sailing along the Cuban coast, quite near the land, which looked so inviting that I made up my mind to go ashore and stay a month in Havana, so I had my baggage got on deck. Soon after dinner, the engines were stopped for some hours for repacking, the captain informing me that it was doubtful whether we should arrive in Havana in time to go ashore that night. At 6 o'clock, the sunset gun is fired, the custom house closes, and no more debarkations are allowed that day. If I went ashore the next day, I must be up and off at an early hour, as the ship sailed at 7:30, so I told the captain if he arrived before 6 o'clock, I would go ashore and wait for the next steamer. But if we were late, I would go on to Vera Cruz with him. Once having made up my mind to go ashore, I was all eagerness to push matters. To do so, I even asked the captain to tell the engineer to force the engines a little if possible. It was well on to 6 o'clock when we steamed past Morro Castle and dropped anchor in the harbour. I engaged 2 of the boats alongside. Our baggage was hurried into them. My wife went down the ladder, and speaking some hurried farewells, I ran down after her and sprang lightly into the boat. That instant the sunset gun was fired. 2 minutes later, and the custom house officers on board would have forbidden my leaving the steamer. I say 2 minutes, but it was less than half a minute. 30 seconds changed my destiny. Chapter 30. Happiness ANDI. Shake hands FOR a time. I have Cuba. What a productive and fertile island it is, with its charming climate and lovely scenery. But, as in so many of the green spots of this world, man has blasted and spoiled all that indulgent nature has lavished here. From the days of Columbus, the story of Cuba has been one of wholesale murder of natives, of revolutions, later of insurrections, and deadly civil strife, which have ruined whole provinces once covered with large sugar, coffee, and tobacco plantations. Slavery now, as in all her past Christian history, is everywhere. Previous to 1861, 40,000 slaves were yearly imported in slave ships into the harbour of Havana. Perhaps all men are cruel when they are absolute masters of the lives and fortunes of their fellows and amenable to none for their acts. Certainly the white Cubans, as a rule, are cruel masters in all their dealings with their slaves. Probably today, certainly in 1873, most of the large plantations witnessed scenes of cruelty never surpassed in the long annals of human servitude. During my stay, I was invited to visit many plantations, but visits to 2 were enough for me, there being too many signs on the surface of the brutality that lay beneath. I could easily give cases that I saw or heard of, but refrained from doing so here. One day's stay in Cuba convinced us we could spend a month very happily on the island, and, discovering that Don Fernando, the proprietor of the hotel, had a furnished house in a lovely situation to let, we resolved to remain, renting the house for a month at a fixed rate per day. This rate included the 10 servants, slaves, in the house, he to furnish good horses and everything except wine. The service proved good, and the cooking exquisite. This was rather expensive, but certainly a handy kind of housekeeping, taking all worry and household cares from my wife's shoulders. There were a large number of American visitors on the island, lovers of and seekers after sunshine and warmth, which they found in abundance while swinging in hammocks under the palm or coconut trees, or in strolling along the white strand, with its innumerable sunny coves, while the winter storms and blizzards were raging in the northern states. Here we formed many pleasant acquaintances, and, throwing off much of the reserve maintained during the voyage, we mingled freely in the nice but gossipy society which winters there. Our house was on a lovely slope in full view of the Gulf of Mexico, and in the midst of what was more like a tropical plantation than a garden. I made the acquaintance of General Talbot, our consul, and was introduced by him to the Spanish officials, including the colonel of police. I assiduously cultivated the acquaintance of the latter, and frequently had him out to the house to dinner and lunch, and felt pretty confident that if any telegrams came about me, he would certainly bring them to me at once for an explanation. Even if my presence became known, and telegraphic orders for my arrest should arrive, no speedy action would be taken, and ample time given me to escape. In all the assemblies, picnics and balls, I was gratified to find my wife very much sought after and admired. It was well she had a few happy days. Enough misery lay not far ahead. In the meantime I had no word from my friends in London. In fact, they did not know where I was. When I bade them goodbye at Calais, they told me not to inform them of my destination until I had got there, and then to do so through some relative. Every day I watched the New York papers to see if there had been any explosion in London, but the silence of the press told me my friends were having an amazing success, and we might expect 2 or 3 months more to elapse before there would be any discovery. We had been some weeks in Havana. It was well into the month of February, when one day, being in my hammock on the veranda, with my wife sitting near me, my servant rode up with the papers, and, handing me the New York Herald, I leisurely opened it, while chatting with my wife, but could not suppress an exclamation when my eyes fell upon an Associated Press dispatch from London in staring headlines. They read, "Amazing fraud upon THEBANKOF England. Millions LOST. Why, ha. Great excitement IN London. L5, 1,000 reward, FORTHE, arrest OFTHE American perpetrator, F.A. Warren. London, Feb. 14, 1873. An amazing fraud has been perpetrated upon the Bank of England by a young American who gave the name of Frederick Albert Warren. The loss of the bank is reported to be from 3 to 10 millions, and it is rumoured that many London banks have been victimised to enormous amounts. The greatest excitement prevails in the city, and the forgery, for such it is the one topic of conversation on the exchange and in the street. The police are completely at fault, although a young man named Noyes, who was Warren's clerk, has been arrested, but it is believed that he is a dupe. The bank has offered a reward of L5,000 for information leading to the arrest of Warren or any confederate. I took a long walk on the beach to think over the situation. I was alarmed over the arrest of Noyes, which I knew ought not to have occurred if the proper precautions had been taken, but I concluded that at the worst his arrest only meant for him a brief incarceration. I knew that no human power and no fear could ever make him betray us. 2 things never entered my calculations at all, that is, that my right name would ever transpire, or that George and Mac would ever, by any possibility, be brought into question for the fraud. So I came back from my walk with my plans outlined. It was to remain quietly where we were for a fortnight longer, then take the steamer to Vera Cruz, go to the city of Mexico, and there buy an estate, as I had originally proposed. Then, after a few months, leave my wife there and travel incog. Through northern Mexico and Texas, meet Mac and George, and afterward return to Mexico. Not a soul in all Europe knew I was in Cuba, and so long as my name did not transpire, I was as safe in Cuba as if in the desert. Consequently, I determined to go on in the same way since our landing. In the meanwhile, I would watch the papers, and if any signs of danger appeared, I could take instant measures for my safety. As the days passed, the cable dispatches appearing in the papers increased in volume, and the papers everywhere had editorials, which, as a rule, were humorous or sarcastic, poking fun at the Britishers in general and the old lady of Threadneedle Street in particular. Then the comic papers took it up, and from week to week published cartoons intended to be funny. One of the funniest of these came out in one of the New York comics, which appeared after the mail arrived from London with the particulars of the simplicity of the bank officials in their dealings with the mysterious F.A. Warren. This full-page cartoon represented a young dude, seated on a mule, riding down a steep declivity. At the bottom the devil stood, holding in the fingers of his extended hands a quantity of 1,000-pound banknotes tempting Warren, and John Bull stood behind the mule, belabouring it with an umbrella and driving Warren down to the devil. I tried to keep the papers from my wife, but one day she came home from a visit with a flushed face and eager to talk, and began telling me about some daring countryman of mine who had the audacity to rob the Bank of England, and who ought to have a whipping. On several occasions, Americans there asked my opinion as to who the party could be. I always told them he was some clever young scamp with plenty of money of his own, who did it for the excitement of the thing and from a wish to take a rise out of John Bull. The next French steamer for Mexico was advertised to land at Havana for passengers and mails for Vera Cruz in a few days, and I determined to sail by her. Soon after my arrival, I had formed the acquaintance of a wealthy young countryman of mine from Savannah by the name of Gray. We soon became fast friends, and I had him out to dinner nearly every day. He had a warm friend in Señor Andres, a rich young Cuban planter, and had accepted an invitation to visit his coffee plantation in the Isle of Pines, the largest of all that immense body of islets and keys of the south coast of Cuba in the Caribbean Sea, one of the loveliest tropical isles imaginable, and Gray insisted upon my making one of the party. It was proposed to spend a week on the island and to take 3 days in going and coming. But if I went, then I would be unable to sail on the steamer of the 25th and would have to wait another week. One day, Gray brought Señor Andres to dinner, along with a common friend, a Señor Alvarez. All three joined in imploring me to make one of the party, promising sport as novel as good, said the wild boars were plentiful, that we would have 2 days shark fishing, turning turtles and hunting their eggs, and could vary it by a slave hunt, the jungle and some of the smaller islands being full of runaways. And as they were by law wild beasts, we might be lucky enough to shoot a few of them. Shoot, not capture, as the planters knew that a runaway slave who had tasted the joys of freedom if caught was useless as a slave. So, as a matter of sport, as well as a warning to other slaves, they organized yearly hunts to bag a score or two. But so great is the depravity of the human heart that these wretches, in their desperate wickedness, objected to being shot, and at times were guilty of the enormity of shooting back again. History records how, on certain occasions, they did so with such good effect that the hunted became hunters. But these were rare events. After long urging I consented. At the time, there were only 2 short railways in all Cuba. We were to cross the island to the south coast, and there embark for the Isle of Pines in a boat owned by our host, which would be in waiting. The railway would take us to the little hamlet of San Felipe, some 40 miles south, and there we were to take horses to the seaport town of Cagio. We were to start on Saturday, 2 days ahead. My wife did not relish my going, and I disliked it more than she did, but for totally different reasons. Mine were that, as a matter of prudence, I ought to recall my consent and remain in Havana until steamer day, and then sail without fail to Mexico. But fearing the ridicule of my friends, I went, persuading myself that there could be no danger, and that everything in London was buried in so dense a fog bank that the detectives would struggle in vain to find a way out of it, or any clue to our identity. Had I known of the clever work of the Pinkerton brothers in London and the discoveries in Paris, I should have been ill at ease. But had I known that Captain John Curtin, then a member of the Pinkerton staff in New York, but now, 1895, of San Francisco, had with perfectly marvelous intuition and rare detective skill let daylight into the whole plot, I had reported to his chief that whenever a Warren was discovered he would prove to be Austin Bidwell. I say if I had known this, instead of going off on a 10 days pleasure jaunt into an isolated corner of the world, I should have taken instant flight, leaving Cuba, not by the usual modes of departure, but by sailing boat and alone for one of the Mexican ports. Captain Curtin had been detailed to work on the New York end of the case, to look for clues. It seemed a hopeless task. He is a warm friend of mine now, after 20 years, and has long forgiven me for the bullet I lodged in him in 1873. A few years after arresting me in the West Indies, he went to San Francisco and started a private inquiry office of his own at 328 Montgomery Street. When, after 20 years' incarceration, I arrived there one lovely May in 1892, he was waiting for me at the ferry and gave me warm greetings, and as hearty congratulations too as any man could give another, then introduced me to his friends everywhere. And, in fact, from the hour of my arrival until my departure, 3 months afterward, was never tired of doing me a service and forwarding my business. So that by his kind offices I made a great success out of what, by reason of the great financial depression, might otherwise have proved a failure. But as Captain Curtin, after effecting my arrest, having recovered from his wound, was one of the 4 who took me to England, I will wait until a later chapter to tell how it was. He discovered my name and located me in Cuba. On Saturday morning, our party of 4, accompanied by a following of blackfellows and half a dozen dogs, set out by train. Before reaching San Felipe, our bones had a shaking. The roadbed was execrable, the trucks of the cars were without springs, and to me it seemed as if we must leave the rails at any moment. In Havana, we regarded Don Andres as a good fellow, but upon our arrival at San Felipe, he had grown into a man of importance. When we came to Cagio, he had grown into a person of distinction, and at the island he had swollen into a local Caesar. At San Felipe, a mere hamlet, horses were waiting for us and mules for the baggage, but before setting out, we went to a nearby hacienda and sat down to what was simply the best lunch of which I ever partook. The town was chiefly remarkable for the number of its fighting cocks. At the hacienda there were dozens, each in its separate compartment, regarded the same as horses and game dogs are in England and America, and half the black boys we met were carrying game birds. At last, starting for Cagio, the road soon degenerated into a mere track, which led through some barren hills with scanty growths of a species of oak without underbrush, and here and there a sprinkling of cacti, and in the lower reaches between the hills grew dense green walls of Spanish bayonet. We were crossing Cuba at its narrowest part, and from San Felipe to Caggio was only some 30 miles. After 15 miles we came into the fertile coast belt and passed a number of deserted sugar plantations where tropic vegetation was trying to cover up the work of ruin wrought by man. Residences and sugar houses destroyed by fire were very much in evidence. To my surprise, I learned that bodies of insurgents, who then held and had held for 6 years nearly the entire eastern province of Santiago de Cuba and Puerto Príncipe, and part of the extreme western province of Pinar del Rio, had only a few weeks before landed by night at the Port La Playa de Batabano, 15 miles away, and with the cry of "Free Cuba" and "Death to the Spaniard," had blotted out the town and then marched into the heart of the country, burning houses, killing the whites and calling upon the slaves to join them in freeing Cuba. Many did, and terrible were their excesses, and terribly did they pay for these. The Spanish soldiers and loyal Cuban volunteers closed in upon them, and at the little hamlet of San Marcos, where we halted and examined the too evident signs of the battle and massacre that followed, they made their last stand, but were no match for their well-armed and disciplined foes. After a desperate struggle, they were overpowered, and every surviving soul was butchered by the infuriated soldiers. It was better so. Had they been spared, it would have only been for the moment, for by official decree of the captain, General of Cuba, endorsed by the Madrid government, every inhabitant within the insurrectionary line, without regard to age or sex, was doomed to death without form of trial. At San Marcos we made a halt to view the scene of the fight, and examined the heaps of ashes where the fires were kindled, which consumed the bodies of the slain. 2 or 3 were my countrymen. At the time it was quite the thing for venturesome Americans to go and join the rebels and help the fight for Cuba Libre. For some years, every few days, notices would appear in the press about some Americans having been shot for joining or attempting to join the rebels. This went on until the affair of the steamer Virginus, when her crew and passengers, to the number of 150, were shot, the steamer having been captured close to the shore and about to land men and guns. Then our government awoke and forbade Spanish officials to shoot Americans without trial. As I stood there curiously examining the marks of the conflict, or examining some part of an unconsumed bone, I little thought that in a very few days I myself would be a fugitive, creeping through jungles and over tropic plains, seeking to join the comrades of the men on whose ashes I was then treading, to aid their fight for free Cuba. Perhaps my subsequent fate made me ponder over my happy life in Cuba, and compare the horrible misery of my prison life, with its hardships and degrading detail, with the brightness of those days, when love, obedience, wealth, and luxury were mine. But in those long years, when in their gloom and depression I was fighting to keep off insanity by ignoring the dreadful present and dwelling on the past, no incident of all my life on the island haunted me more than this at San Marcos. Every detail was photographed on my brain, and as I recalled that blackened spot strewn with ashes soddened by tropical rains, soon to be all the greener for the fertilizing tragedy, many 1,000 times I said, "Would to God my ashes were mingled with the dead there." Soon after leaving San Marcos, striking into the jungle, the road became so narrow that we had to go single file. I found the silence of the tropical forest impressive, and think it had its effect on us all. Even the Negroes and dogs moved on, making no sound. Although novel scenes, yet I was glad when 5 o'clock came and we emerged from the jungle onto the coast road. It was sandy but well travelled. Another mile, and we were in Caggio, and the Caribbean, blue and lovely as a dream, lay spread before us, with hundreds of palm-crowned islets and coral bays, all with sandy beaches of dazzling whiteness. Signor Andres had a house here, and as they had notice of our coming, everything was prepared for our reception. Entering the house, we were served with black coffee and thin rice cakes fried. Gray and I wanted a swim before supper in the waters, which looked very tempting, but it would have been a breach of etiquette to indulge then. And, by the way, there is a strange repugnance to water inherent in the Spanish nature, there being no bathhouses in Spain, they say, and I believe it. Gray and I, during the next few days, were in and out of the water at all hours, but could never persuade anyone else to try the experiment of the swim in the warm water of the Caribbean. At the house, or when out in boats, we frequently invited some of the company to join us in a plunge, but none ever accepted the invitation. We are told, on good authority, that our virtues depend on the interpretation of the times, and one might add, on the interpretation of our nation. The Anglo-Saxon loves soap and water, and plenty of it. The Spaniard does not. But this contrast may mean nothing in our favour. There may be a reason for it, racial probably, but possibly climatic. Supper came, and it was a treat. Gray and I noted that in suitability of material to the purpose intended, and in cookery, it excelled anything in our experience. Café Reach and Tortoni's were not in it. We were curious to see the cook. She was ordered in for our inspection, a sober, sad-faced negress, angular, bony, and, strangely enough, knew only a few words of Spanish, her language being some African dialect, Africa being her natal place, as it, indeed, was of most of the slaves. What views of life, what views of the Christian world most of these slaves must have. Torn from their homes, leaving their slaughtered family on the ashes of their homes, and carried off to toil and wear out the only life nature will ever give them. For what? To toil amid hunger and abuse too foul to name, in order that the Christian robber may have gold to gratify his desire. She was evidently alarmed over the summons. It might mean anything. She was unused to the coin of compliment. But we gave it freely, however, and the next morning each of us did better, and when departing placed a sovereign in her hand and made Señor Andres promise to be good to her. Our host grew his own tobacco and made his own cigars. These were famous even in Havana, and Gray and I enjoyed them that evening. A number of grass-woven hammocks were swung under a roof in front of the house. It was delightful lying there watching the phosphorescent waves rippling or breaking on the beach under the light of a full moon and listening to the chatter or the songs of the blackfellows who swarmed around while smoking cigars worth the smoking. The Negro children, shrill-voiced and loud, were very much in evidence. The air was delightful, and following the custom of the country, we slept in the hammocks without undressing. The next morning, under a sunrise sky, which in its glowing colours looked like the New Jerusalem, Gray and I made a break for the glorious water that rippled on the beach. What a swim we had! We were the only humans visible. All other unfeathered bipeds were asleep, and we varied our bath by wandering around the beach in a state of nature, viewing things generally, but a turtle pond held us fascinated. Stakes had been driven down enclosing a space, and upward of 20 great turtles were prisoners, waiting apparently with the greatest of patience to be devoured. That being, so far as I can see, the ultimate destination of all life. That huge procession to the stomach. The rocks tell us that it began a good while ago, and it has kept up with crowded ranks ever since. When the missionary landing in Fiji anxiously inquired of the boss cannibal gentleman where his predecessor might be sojourning, he was promptly informed that he had gone into the interior. To go into the interior is the decree fate writes in her book of doom and copies on the birth certificate of all the breathers of the world. Chapter 31. The Philistines, ARE, upon THEE, Samson. I was very fortunate in my servant Nun, he being devoted to me, a resolute fellow as well, and thoroughly trustworthy. He felt very badly over my leaving him behind in Havana, nor would I have done so under ordinary circumstances. The day before leaving on the trip, taking him aside, but not wishing to actually disclose anything, I talked in a very impressive, grave way, instructing him to leave Havana secretly after telling his mistress that I had ordered him to go to Matanzas, a city 40 miles east by rail. He was to bring all the New York papers, meet me at Cagio, and not let a soul know his destination, but be there awaiting my arrival from the Isle of Pines the following Sunday week. If in the meantime anything unusual, no matter what, happened, then he was instantly to depart for Cagio. There hire a boat and crew and come after me, not to mind expense and not to lose a moment's time. None was one of those wise men who know how to obey orders without self-questionings as to the whys and wherefores. I had secured gun licenses from the authorities, and, giving them to None, ordered him to bring a breech-loader and a brace of revolvers with him. During my stay in the Isle of Pines, I would be out of reach of the outside world. If on meeting None I found from the papers he brought that there was any sign of danger, I would not return to Havana, but would secure a boat, provision it, set sail alone for some port in Central America, and send my servant back after my wife. At 10 o'clock, our party set out in an open-decked cargo boat from Cagio for San Jose, 70 miles across the water and on the west coast of the island. San Jose was one of the half-dozen plantations belonging to our host, the chief product being coffee, and on this one there were 130 slaves. We had a motley cargo, 20 blackfellows, dogs, turtles, fighting cocks, 2 trained pigs, a good-sized snake that answered to the name of Jacko and had the run of the ship. Ship, men, women and young darkies, trained pigs and everything except we. 3 guests were the absolute property of our host. We were passing through the gate of the Gulf of Matamano. The bottom was so white and the water so clear that we could see distinctly all the wondrous marine life beneath. Ashore in the thick forests all seemed to be dead, but here in the water and beneath the surface all was teeming with life. Flocks of seafowl were in the air, or whitened the rocks which everywhere rose above the waters, and innumerable little islets rested like lovely pictures in the blue setting of the sea. At one of the loveliest, called Cayos de Tana, with a wide fringe of white beach, we landed, that is, our boat ran toward it, until the keel stuck in the sand, when a dozen black fellows sprang over into the water, and, taking us white trash on their shoulders, carried us ashore. Once there we set out to find turtle eggs, and soon found heaps of sand which, when scraped away, revealed the eggs in dozens. We took away about a bushel, but they had a rancid flavour, so Gray and I backed out of our promise to eat them, as did Signors Andres and Mondago. The man in charge of the boat was a skilful sailor, and, having a fine breeze, we rushed through the water at a great rate. At last, after a day of novel enjoyment, just as the short twilight of the tropics was fading out, we ran alongside of the little pier of San Jose, and were welcomed with loud shouts and gunshots from about 100 gaudily attired slaves, who were excited and seemingly glad over the return of their master, this being Sunday and a holiday. Did any of my readers ever think what the rest of Sunday is to the toilers of the earth? If Christ left no other legacy to the Christian world but that happy day of rest, then must we still bless and praise him as the mighty benefactor of the world, the saviour and glorious hero of the working man. For 19 years I toiled, exposed to every storm that blew, and was sustained through all the 6 days' misery by the blessed knowledge that Sunday, with its rest, was never far off. And when the Sunday morning dawned, and the happy consciousness filled my mind, that for one day at least I was free from toil, my heart filled with gratitude to the Galilean carpenter, who, by his gracious deeds and genius, had so impressed the hearts of men that for his sake they had taken the 7th day of the Hebrew and bequeathed it as a day of rest to all the toiling generations of the sons of men. The Roman Empire, which overshadowed the world and held the nations in subjection, knew no day of rest, and today the toiling millions of China never wait to say, "This is a day of rest on which I can turn my thoughts to other things than toil." I must not here enter into details of that week of rare sport and keen enjoyment in the Isle of Pines. We went shark fishing by day and tipping turtles in the moonlight by night, when they came ashore to deposit their eggs in the sand. One never-ending source of enjoyment to the Cubans was the battles of the fighting cocks. I had got over some of my repugnance to the sport and enjoyed it almost as well as the cocks themselves. How soon one learns to do in Rome as do the Romans. The week had come to an end, and, although importuned by my host to delay my departure, my anxiety as to the state of affairs in the outside world was too great to postpone my return to the mainland. So, after a rousing send-off from everyone on the plantation, I departed. Just as the sun was flinging its dyes over the clouds and waters, 1 week from the Sunday of my arrival at San Jose, I was sailing into the little bay of Cagio. Gray was to remain another week, and I was returning in a small sloop manned by 2 of Signor Andres's men. I found none waiting for me on the beach. He handed me a letter from my wife and said everything was well at home. Opening the letter, I found an earnest appeal to return at once. Going to the hacienda nearby, I took the bundle of New York and London papers none had brought. I went to my room, and opening the Herald, I was amazed to see the storm over the Bank of England business and the great desire to discover the mysterious Warren. I felt that the time had come when it would no longer be prudent for me to live under my right name. It was an easy matter to invent a name and live under it, and I determined to do so, for a time at least, until after I saw how matters developed. But I could not do this in Havana, for in case of using an alias, it would be necessary to take my wife into my confidence. She was sure to discover the matter sooner or later, and it was better for her to learn the miserable truth from my own lips than to leave the discovery to come to her through the public press. In Mexico, I should really have nothing to fear, even if it was known I was there. So, after some cogitation, I determined to return to Havana, say goodbye to all our friends, and embark as soon as possible for Vera Cruz. I was impatient to set off at once, but it was both dangerous and difficult work to go through the jungle by night, so telling Nun to be ready to start at sunrise, I went to bed. At dawn, we set out and did not halt until we reached San Marcos, with its gloomy memorial of human savagery. After an hour's halt, we set out and arrived at San Felipe in time to catch the train to Havana. On arriving there at dusk, I sent my servant to inform his mistress of my safe arrival while I called on Don Fernando at the hotel. His frank and hearty reception told me at once that he had heard nothing, and he knows pretty well everything going on in the town. From the hotel, I drove to the police barracks and called on the colonel of police, with the same result, which satisfied me beyond all doubt that however the storm blew in London or New York, there was not a single cloud on the horizon in Havana. But it was soon to blow a hurricane. I had a very happy meeting with my wife, and found her the picture of health and happiness. As I looked in her face, beaming with confidence and faith, I realized how hard it would be to tell her the terrible truth, and what a shock it would be to her when she discovered the husband she believed the soul of honor stood in danger of a prison. Yet I was tolerably certain she would forgive me upon my promise never to do wrong again. She had sent out invitations to dinner for Thursday to 20 friends. There was then a steamer in the harbour advertised to sail in 2 days for Mexico, and I had thought of going by her. Had we, this book would never have been written. As invitations were out for Thursday, I concluded to wait for Saturday's steamer, but determined to sail on that day without fail. Under our system of housekeeping, a dinner party was a simple thing. We merely had to notify our landlord how many guests we expected, and the thing was done, so far as we were concerned. Don Fernando would send his hotel steward down to the house with reinforcements of cooks and waiters, and my wife had simply to usher the guests into the dining room and out again. Don Fernando's supernumeraries did the rest. On the day of our dinner, I was strongly tempted to give some hint to my wife that I was in some way entangled in a web, but as she was so happy I could not do it, but resolved to wait until we were settled in Mexico, and then to tell her a little, but not all the truth. My wife, all unconscious of the frightful calamity impending, entered upon the last half-day of happiness she was to know for many long years. The same statement would be true of myself. As the guests were arriving, I was in a happy vein, and in the same happy frame of mind sat down to dinner. 20 happy mortals, but not one divined the termination of that dinner party, least of all the proud and happy hostess. It was a great success, and at 8 o'clock was drawing to a close. The long windows were open, while the warm breeze from the nearby gulf was pouring through the room. The clock had just chimed the quarter when there came a sudden rush of feet over the veranda and through the hall. All eyes were fixed on the open door leading to the hall when an eager, resolute-faced man, evidently an American, stepped with a firm pace into the room, followed by a dozen civilians and soldiers. With a quick glance over the company, his eyes rested on me, and coming direct to my chair, while my guests gazed in amazement, he bowed and said in a low voice, "Mr. Bidwell, I am sorry to disturb your dinner party or to annoy you in any way, but I am forced to tell you I have a warrant in my pocket for your arrest upon a charge of forgery upon the Bank of England. The warrant is signed by the Captain, General of Cuba, everything is in due form, and you are my prisoner. I am William Pinkerton. Every man who enters the arena and joins in the struggle of life has more or fewer takedowns in his history. But my wish is that between this hour and my last I may have no more takedowns so near the freezing point as this was." I shall never forget the look on my wife's face. First she gazed at the intruders with indignation, then turned to me with a look of eager expectation, as much as to say, "Wait till my husband raises his arm and you will all go down." But instead of seeing me rise, indignant and angry, driving the intruders out, she saw me talking quite calmly to Curtin. Then her face grew deadly white. None of the guests heard Pinkerton's words, but, as will be easily imagined, there was a painful silence which I broke by standing up and saying that there was some unhappy mistake, that I was arrested upon the charge of furnishing arms to the insurrectionists in the eastern provinces. I requested my friends to withdraw at once, and everything would be explained on the morrow. There were 5 soldiers present, Mr. Crawford, the English Consul General, Pinkerton and Captain John Curtin, my servant Nun being in custody of the latter. It was a strange and unhappy scene, and everyone felt extremely awkward and ill at ease, especially the writer. In the rear of the dining room was a large sitting room, where I kept my valuables in trunks and did my writing. I turned to Mr. P. and said, "Will you come in the other room?" "Certainly," he replied, without the slightest hesitation. The room was brilliantly lighted. Motioning him to a seat, I said, Will you have a glass of wine? Yes, but I never drink anything but Clicquot, replied Mr. Pinkerton pleasantly. A servant brought in a bottle and glasses, and I turned the conversation upon the subject of money. The captain, being a stranger to me, guided by former experience with Irving & Co. I fancied he might be bribed. Sometimes the police are susceptible to this form of temptation, and I was at bay and desperate. I intended to offer him a fortune for a bribe. If he refused to take it, I resolved to shoot him and dash out of the window, for at my elbow was an open drawer with a loaded revolver ready at my hand. I said, "You know the power and value of money?" "Yes, and I need and want plenty of it." Pointing to a trunk, I said, "I have a fortune there. Sit where you are 10 minutes, give no alarm, and I will give you 50,000. Then a scene ensued that if put upon the stage would be deemed far-fetched, if not incredible. When I said this, the captain never moved a muscle, but looked at me seriously, earnestly, then dropped his eyes to the bottle. As he did so, I placed my hand on the revolver. He took the bottle up, filled his glass, and looking steadily at me, drank it off, and, replacing the glass on the stand, coolly remarked, "Why, sir, that is 5,000 a minute." "Yes, and good pay too," I said. "But I won't have it," he interjected, and sprang to his feet as he saw me make a movement, but I was too quick for him. I fired point blank, and down he went as if felled by lightning. I rushed to the window, when the Venetians were torn violently down, and one of Curtin's subordinates, revolver in hand, sprang from the outer darkness through the window into the room, and the others came with the soldiers. My wife, too, white-faced, rushed in from the dining-room. A lively struggle followed, in which Curtin, having risen from the floor, joined. The struggle was soon over, leaving me a prisoner under close guard. My bullet had struck the captain, breaking a rib and glancing off, but he was game, and when we shortly after departed for the city, he rode with me in the same carriage. I tried to soothe my wife's fears, but it was attempting the impossible, so we drove away to the city in 3 carriages, Mr. P. assuring my wife that I would sleep at the hotel. By the time we arrived, the news had spread among the American colony, and as the hotel was a sort of American club, delegations of my acquaintances speedily arrived. All were loud in the denunciation of the outrage. Of course, they saw things on the surface only. Soon our Consul General Talbot arrived and assured me he would see that I should be treated with every consideration until such time as the unfortunate mistake was corrected. That night I slept at the hotel with Curtin and his 2 companions for roommates. Mr. P. took his wound and close call very good-naturedly, and said he did not blame me at all, but felt taken down to think I had got the drop on him. Early the next morning, my friend, the Chief of Police, Colonel Marino de Vascos, called on me, indignant and angry that I should suffer such discourtesy. He was particularly indignant over the insult to himself in not being consulted, so that he could have sent me a note to call on him and explain. Then he turned to Pinkerton and told him to liberate me, as he would be responsible for me whenever wanted. But the captain knew what he was about, and knew his business too well and the backing he had to pay any attention to Colonel Vascos. I claimed the protection of our consul, but Talbot regretfully told me that on account of the orders Pinkerton bore from the State Department at Washington, he was forced to consent to my detention, but he would not permit me to be kept in the ordinary prison. So about 12 o'clock next day, I was transferred to the police barracks and put into the Lieutenant of Police's room, and a guard of soldiers placed over me. The New York Herald of the next day contained the following editorial: New York Herald, Feb. 26, 1873. Cuban Affairs, Bidwell's imprisonment. The special telegraphic advices which we publish today in reference to the arrest and imprisonment at Havana of Bidwell, one of the parties accused of the recent forgeries on the Bank of England, are very interesting, touching the jurisdiction of the island authorities in this matter. It appears that Bidwell was arrested at the request of the British government on the supposition that he was a British subject, but it is represented that he is a citizen of the United States of America, and that his arrest in Cuba is not justified by any extradition treaty with England, nor by any authority except that of the Captain General, whose will over the island is the supreme law. If it can be established that Bidwell is a citizen of the United States, his case certainly calls for the intervention of the Secretary of State. The prisoner, it seems, desires a transfer to New York, which is perfectly natural, but we suspect that the international difficulties suggested touching his detention in Cuba will not materially improve his chances of escape. Such proceedings could be carried out in no other country than Cuba, where the captain, General, does not always act in accordance with law. Distinguished lawyers and judges of that city, in conversation with the Herald correspondent, denounced the act as being utterly illegal and without precedent. Cable dispatch to the London Times, March 3, 1873. Havana, Cuba, March 2, 1873. Great efforts are being made by the lawyers and prominent citizens here to obtain the release of Bidwell, supposed to be Warren. Tomorrow the American consul will demand his release on the ground that he is an American citizen. The British consul, General E.H. Crawford, is doing everything in his power to counteract these efforts. There is great excitement here over Bidwell's arrest, and the popular sympathy is with him. By cable from Havana to New York Herald, March 31, 1873. Bidwell, the alleged Bank of England forger, whose arrest caused so much excitement here, escaped by jumping from the second-story balcony of the police barracks late last night in the presence of his guards. He was partly dressed at the time. Bidwell and his wife are greatly liked here, and no doubt his Havana friends, seeing the impossibility of counteracting by legal means the efforts of the British consul to secure his extradition, planned the affair. It is the general opinion that John Bull has seen the last of Bidwell, there being dozens of planters in the district ready and willing to shelter him, which they can do effectually.